Good evening. Thank you all for coming here tonight to this very memorable occasion. Before we get into anything else, before I introduce others, I'd like to make a special recognition to Yolanda Kihi. For having the insight to put this together. Thank you so very much. We do expect some more people, but if not, we are all here to hear from our three panelists this evening. And we have Jean-Pierre, Brutus, we have Taja-Nia. I had to ask her, how do you pronounce your name? Taja-Nia Henderson. And we have Walter Greason. Thank you very much for taking the time to come here to the Jersey City Free Public Library. We do appreciate your presence here this evening, and we hope that whatever information you give our audience this evening, that it will be information that we can actually do something with and remember exactly what you said. Before I go any further, I'd also like to introduce our library director and our assistant library director. We have Director Terry Hill here in the audience with us. And we have our assistant director, Kate, in the back. And again, thank you all for coming. At this time, I am going to not waste any time, but before that, just a little housekeeping. First, let's please make sure we have our phones on vibrate, silence, because we don't want to disturb our speakers when they get ready to give us this important information. And of course, the restrooms are right out here through that door. So we're going to have a conversation, or our panelists are going to have a conversation tonight about reparations. This is being sponsored by the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, Jersey City Free Public Library in conversation, New Jersey Reparations Counsel. I now turn it over to our panelists. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me? Can you hear me? Yes. Good evening. Can you hear me now? Yes. All right. Wonderful. Wonderful. So first, I just want to say my name is Jean-Pierre Brutus. I just want to thank you so much for you all for being here this evening. I want to thank Dr. Richardson, Director Terry Hill, Yolanda, as well as all the Jersey City Free Public Library staff for putting this together. And I want to thank you all for taking time on your Friday evening for being here with us. As I said, I'm Jean-Pierre Brutus. I'm a senior counsel in the Economic Justice Program at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. I also lead the Institute's Reparations Advocacy, and I was the convener of New Jersey Reparations Council. For those of you who may not be aware, the Institute, we are located in Newark. We are in our actual 26th year of advocacy. We're an organization that focuses on racial and social justice advocacy at the state level here in New Jersey. We are led by our wonderful president and CEO, Ryan P. Haygood. We are a small staff of about 20-something folks, and we work in 4 different areas: democracy and justice, criminal justice reform, environmental justice, and economic justice. Recently, the Institute was advocating for a reparations task force in New Jersey. That legislation did not move, so we launched our own task force, which we call the New Jersey Reparations Council. That was in June of 2023 in Perth Amboy, and we chose Perth Amboy because that was a major site for the trafficking of enslaved people here in New Jersey. And this past June, on June 2025, we released the council's final report, which some of you have. It's right here for such a time as this, the Nowness of Reparations for Black people in New Jersey. And as part of that, we would like to take the report off the shelves and into the streets to the people. And we really want to engage the people of New Jersey on this report. And so we want to engage in events like this. And it is my honor to have two members of the council here with us tonight. One of our co-chairs, Dr. Taja-Nia Henderson, and one of the co-directors of our Economic Justice Committee, Dr. Walter Greason. I'll introduce them, and then we'll get started with the panel discussion. So excuse me 1 second. Thankfully, Taja-Nia and Walter will be doing most of the talking this evening. All right, so just to introduce both of them, I'll start off with Dean Henderson. Taja-Nia Henderson formerly served as the Dean of the Graduate School at Rutgers University, Newark, where she's also a professor at Rutgers Law School. Her scholarship focuses on the historical impact of punishment regimes on property systems in the US, and she's particularly interested in the legal histories of incarceration and chattel slavery. Dr. Henderson's research on property and prisons has been published in numerous law reviews and featured in the New York Times and Teen Vogue. Dr. Henderson's research has been supported by the John Kluge Center at the Library of Congress and the American Philosophical Society. Please clap your hands for Dr. Henderson. And Dr. Walter Greason is a founding scholar and historian of Afrofuturist design. He is an author, editor, and contributor to more than 20 books, mostly notably the award-winning books Suburban Erasure, Illmatic Consequences, The Black Reparations Project, and The Graphic History of Hip Hop. His work on the Timothy Thomas Fortune Cultural Center has garnered international acclaim for the innovative use of digital technology, leading to multiple urban revitalization projects in Minnesota, Florida, New Jersey, and Louisiana. He appeared on dozens of mass media outlets in the United States and around the world. Please clap for Dr. So as we open it up this evening, I want to ask Taja-Nia, as the co-chair of the council, can you please tell us about your role and your overarching perspective of the report, especially anything that you learned or surprised you?
Thank you, Jean-Pierre, and thank you to everyone who's here tonight. It's really heartening to see folks interested and engaged with all of this work and with this information, and we hope that you will tell a friend that you were here and introduce this report to them. So as one of the co-chairs, really, I sort of took the role to be one of facilitator. We were certainly fortunate to have more than 40 subject matter experts working on the council. And when I say experts, like the people in the field in New Jersey who you would turn to if you had a question or if you needed an advocate, these folks were working with us. And so I didn't see my role to be one of expert. I saw my role to be one of a champion of experts. So I joined committee meetings, I dropped in, I offered to support, I helped the committees to assess existing resources, helped the committees to pursue lines of inquiry. And I really think that sort of in the year when we were building up the material that would eventually sort of mature into the report that you're holding in your hands, I think champion and cheerleader was my most important job. When you have folks who are working their regular day jobs and sort of also doing this as a labor of love, it's important that they feel valued. And so I wanted folks to know, you're not showing up to these meetings just y'all, I'm here too. You're not tracking down this random obscure source, I'm helping you track it down. I'm offering things to the committee and offering my time as well. And I think that kind of helped us keep our momentum going and also helped us to kind of cohere as a council instead of, discrete sort of standalone committees working all by themselves and not really knowing much about what was going on elsewhere. In terms of what I'm kind of most proud of is I'm most proud that this is here and that people are interested and that we have an opportunity to forever change New Jersey's history. I think this is a moment when it may seem as if opportunities are few. It may seem as if opportunities for real progress and for, corrective action are slipping through our fingers. But what this whole initiative has sort of helped me to believe is that we have a window, and for such a time as now, even in the face of everything that we are seeing, and we'll talk about some of that this evening, I think this is our moment. And it's super important that we sort of take the charge and see this not as somebody else's story or somebody else's history, but rather our shared collective history, and one that we want to share with other folks.
Thank you so much, Taja-Nia, and I thank you for raising that up about this collective history and responsibility, particularly at this moment, and this use of nowness, right, about urgency, and the relevance of the report to this moment in our history, and about how we can move forward. Walter, as the co-director of the Economic Justice Committee, can you please tell us about your role and your overarching perspective of the report? Also, anything that you learned or anything that surprised you in the report?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here with all of you. This started for me around 1996, 1997. My dissertation came out of the fact that I'm New Jersey native, born in Freehold, grew up in Manalapan, large farming areas that by that point had started getting wiped off the map. That to create a lot of suburbs across the state, the farming areas were cannibalized. They were sold at modest prices to then be resold as suburbs at really massive profits. And so that was my first two books. And literally when I went to publishers to say, okay, this is what I've been studying, I would say Rutgers University Press especially, no one's interested in the Black history of New Jersey. Like, it was just that flat. And so it was a struggle doing the work and then getting it through the peer review process and shaping a conversation that would lead to the report. To serve as part of the team, I can't think of a greater honor in my life. Like, there are a lot of amazing things, but this is the best. For such a time as this, the Nowness of Reparations, the conversations we've had over the last 2 to 3 years, these things were not possible a decade ago. No one would entertain the conversation. People did not recognize that slavery was a significant part of New Jersey's history. So, number one, having written a lot of articles and contributed to books on the subject, just persuading people to take slavery in the North, slavery before the American Revolution, seriously, that's a huge leap forward. That most folks, most scholars who study this prior to the Civil War. And why does it then lead to the kind of sectional conflict in the 19th century? We've had a quantum leap forward in understanding that the uniformity of slavery across the British colonies was a huge part of why there was an American Revolution. And so that piece is especially important here in Jersey City. The particular relevance going north from Newark, where so many of the initial investors in the colony had made their money in the Caribbean through the slave trade, through the various different kinds of agricultural production. But here, in the establishment of both East and West Jersey, it was the phrase I use is commodification. The way that Africans were used not just as labor, and particularly not as agricultural labor, but as commercial and industrial labor. The first really big plantation is down, it's the Tinton Iron Works, owned by Gouverneur Morris. And it's made to provide the steel, the iron that builds bridges, that makes it possible to have auction sites like we see in Perth Amboy, the docks that people where the ships come to unload the Africans that they've kidnapped. The use of enslaved African labor was about growing a market economy. And this contradicts the way so much of the history is told, is that slavery was backwards and feudal, and it was not a part of what led to the modern world. And that's just the opposite of what happens in New Jersey. We build a modern economy off of enslaved labor, and even more importantly, the use of enslaved people as money, a way to transport economic value when dollars don't really carry much weight and gold and silver is rare. That piece of complicating that 18th century story of how we get to the American Revolution, limits like gradual emancipation that New Jersey loves to brag about, is actually extended enslavement. People are held in bondage longer, to the point you still have people held as slaves at the time the 13th Amendment is adopted. And this is before we get into any of the 20th century stuff about segregation of schools, segregation of neighborhoods, the way Jim Crow segregation defined New Jersey's growth as a state economy in the early 20th century. So all of those things wrapped into this one report, it is beyond miraculous. And for me, having literally bled fighting to get any part of this to be taken seriously, I just can't emphasize enough how extraordinary this project has been.
Thank you so much, Walter, for that. And, just a testament to how much this means to Walter. Walter flew in from Minneapolis today to join us this evening. So that we appreciate that greatly. And, as you were talking, Walter, two things came to mind. When I was coming out of the PATH train to walk over here, one of the streets is named Pavonia, right? Named after the sort of colonial settlement, right? And so that you see the reality of history on our present moment. And I think it speaks to the point that in part what Walter was making about enslavement in New Jersey built New Jersey as an economic power, right? And so that gets overlooked in the story and the telling about the impact of slavery on a northern state like New Jersey. So thank you so much, Walter, for raising that. And going over to Taja-Nia, Taja-Nia, I'd like to ask you, as a historian of slavery and punishment regimes, can you tell us about the racial terror Black people in New Jersey were subjected to from slavery to the present?
Sure. So before the revolution, you have about 80, almost 90 years of Africans being imported into New Jersey. And by the time of the revolution, at least in the major towns on the west side, on the east side of New Jersey, slavery is fairly ubiquitous. So we know from census records that at the time of the revolution in Perth Amboy, there were 300 white households and 299 of them held enslaved people in bondage. So when we are talking about the sort of ubiquity, everydayness of slavery in New Jersey, we are talking about places like Perth Amboy and places like Newark and places like Jersey City, where slavery was quite common. And you can read about that as you flip through your sections of your copies of the report. The report, in addition to the sort of the ubiquity of slavery and the fact that people were being held in bondage, and for folks who maybe aren't super familiar, this is a generational bondage, meaning those initial Africans were held, and then their offspring were held for life, and then their offspring were held for life. And there were very few, if any, pathways for people to be freed in New Jersey. So this is multiple generations of people being held in bondage after being stolen. The report also talks about how enslaved people in New Jersey were subjected to pretty barbaric forms of torture when they encountered the legal system. And in this way, New Jersey was not unlike other places in the North. The North was brutal. Slavery here was as brutal as it was in the South. Though there were fewer impacted people, the slavery was as brutal as it was in the plantation South. And so we have examples that are mentioned in the report of people being burned alive, people having parts amputated, hand cut, foot cut, this sort of thing. So that's in the report, and you can see it. This is a bloody history. And when we're sort of those who might claim that New Jersey practiced a more benign form of slavery, I hope you will bring to their attention some of the men who are discussed in this report, whose bodies were torn apart while they were still alive and suffered in a pretty horrific way. After emancipation, of course, the terror regime changed, though it did not disappear altogether. So we have evidence of lynching in New Jersey that is also discussed here in the report. And when Paul Robeson, you may be familiar with Paul Robeson was a lawyer, he was an activist, he was a man who this country tried to kill. His passport was taken from him, his citizenship was stripped, right? Not taken, but like impacted. He could not travel because he was deemed to be a communist. The thing to know about Paul Robeson is a child of New Jersey. Yes. He's also a child of formerly enslaved people in New Jersey. And so when Paul Robeson talks about his childhood and growing up in this state, he grew up in Princeton. And the Princeton of Paul Robeson's memories was a plantation. Paul Robeson describes living in Princeton and growing up there as living on a Southern-style plantation. Those are his words, not mine. And so you can sort of see what kind of terror Paul Robeson must have experienced as a young child living in a place where, even the smallest of missteps, the smallest of transgressions could lead to really severe consequences for him and his family. It was that history of growing up in New Jersey at the turn of the century that really radicalized Paul Robeson. It's not just his trips to Russia, it's also what happens in New Jersey that radicalizes Paul Robeson. And so as Jim Crow also sort of gains its strength here in the state, and so now I'm thinking about 1900 to 1960s, some of the same injustices that you see elsewhere in this country, you see in New Jersey, including the rise of a racist Ku Klux Klan. So New Jersey has a Klan. That Klan holds huge marches. Those marches are through the streets, into churches. They're speaking from the pulpits in New Jersey in Klan hoods. And this is happening right here in this state. And so this is the sort of, we talk about racial terror, right? Terror can take many forms, but I think it's important that, again, when folks wish to tell you that the history of slavery in New Jersey was a benign one, and that New Jersey is an opportunity state, remind them of a time when churches allowed Klansmen to preach from pulpits in hoods.
Thank you so much, Taja-Nia, and thank you for sort of giving us a kind of texture to the depth of the level of violence, the physical violence, the cultural violence, the psychological violence that began slavery but continued after slavery through Jim Crow and segregation in New Jersey, even up to the present moment. And this undergirds the kind of policies and the practices around segregation and economic stratification. And so Walter, moving on, connected to that, as a historian of segregation and economic stratification in New Jersey, can you tell us about how racial segregation developed and continues to persist in New Jersey?
So, how much more time do we have? No, that's the story we live with to this very moment. To think and frame it for everybody, I think in the industrial piece is really important. So I wrote 4 books after I did my New Jersey histories about what I learned theoretically about the point that you asked. In particular, well, the 2 at the core of the series. One is titled Industrial Segregation, because we often talk about de facto and de jure in terms of the kinds of laws or lack of laws that govern segregation. But it allows us to obscure the differences that are economic about these systems. And so agricultural segregation is what we end up studying about prior to the Civil War, and then the models that Southern states implement using black codes and Jim Crow laws that persist until you get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So you essentially have 2 centuries of the persistence of agricultural segregation. But again, to state from what happens in New Jersey, the industrial forms of segregation in the state, again, were pervasive. They're not just in New Jersey, they're also in New York and Connecticut and Pennsylvania. Ohio, tremendous pioneer in shaping the ways they limited opportunities for African Americans. And so these things date back to the 1820s, which is within a generation after you have the implementation of the really ineffective transatlantic slave trade ban in 1808. These kinds of restrictions on enslavement in the North, that New Jersey is the last to adopt a law in 1804. So there's always this investment in the control of black people. That's profound. That is, I think the worst cases I'd seen were in major urban cities across the country. There were things called laughing barrels. So if African Americans felt the need, heard a funny joke, thought a funny thought, they were required by law to go into an alleyway and stick their head in a barrel as they laughed, because it was deemed a threat to white authority and the sanctity of white life in public. And so it's impossible to capture quickly the dimensions of ways segregation shaped daily life. To try and give y'all a hint, the industrial aspects, y'all will be readily aware that there's massive occupational discrimination, that most jobs that paid well across the US between 1880 and 1960 had real barriers. It was very rare for African Americans to get jobs in manufacturing, which tended to pay well, did not have high educational requirements. Within that also has the consequences of restricting the possibilities of home ownership. And I'll have to come back to that in some more detail when we get out of the Great Depression. But in the period prior to 1932 and the election of FDR and the way we create the first New Deal, black home ownership in any part of the country is largely an expression of massive individual effort. That there'd be generational savings, there'd be an attempt to then work through a church to secure something that could be a small loan to acquire the timber, but then the homeowners would have to build the house themselves because there were no realtors or big firms that would come and build the homes that African Americans would live in. And so the occupational discrimination turns into very specific forms of housing segregation and the inability to create wealth. Now, against that, in this early period, there are some astonishing things that happen that black people are able to overcome those barriers. The expansions of black churches after Reconstruction, the creation of the historically black college and university system. These are extraordinary achievements given the obstacles that people faced. And here in New Jersey, they have really profound impacts. So you mentioned the T. Thomas Fortune Cultural Center. This is a man who was a mentor to Booker T. Washington and wrote his speeches as he rose to prominence. He trained Ida Wells Barnett as a journalist. He trained W.E.B. Du Bois as a writer before he went to Harvard. He came back from kind of the pinnacle of his life as a diplomat for Theodore Roosevelt and mentored Marcus Garvey in the creation of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Yet he got wiped out of the record, mainly by Washington's people, who wanted Washington to have the credit for how black people responded to racial segregation. But Fortune lived here. In fact, I'll tell you all a little secret I have not written and put out yet. He comes here at the urging of Frederick Douglass and the first black Episcopal minister, Alexander State. That there are opportunities here that we don't have in Maryland and Virginia. And so Fortune initiates what ends up becoming the NAACP and the Niagara movement in the decades that follow. But he shapes what we think of as the Black Power and the Civil Rights agenda of the earliest 21st century, or the early 20th century. And so that's all this counter narrative to the limitations that Black people have due to segregation. Even within the boundaries, we create this extraordinary set of institutions that create what we will come to know as the Civil Rights Movement. Dr. King comes and studies in New Jersey, and his first experience of real discrimination and violent repression comes in South Jersey. And so we're central to the story of how we win our freedom in the 20th century. So I've said I had to circle back to housing because it's just too pervasive a story at this point. Really good friend of mine who inspired me to do the work I do is a guy named Kenneth Jackson, published a book called Crabgrass Frontier. And in that book exposes for the first time the way the Federal Housing Administration in 1937 used a series of documents from a private organization called the Homeowners Loan Corporation to essentially standardize the way discrimination would operate in the housing market. Most of y'all would have come across this phrase as redlining, that there are maps in banking institutions where they identify 4 different codes for their areas. I'm really going to try not to belabor this. But A quality areas, green lined areas, approved for loans with very low interest, high desirability, lots of people, white. It's the opposite side of the segregation that we're discussing. B and C are of mixed income, sometimes some immigrant neighborhoods, mainly Western European immigrants. Could be in B and C quality areas. C quality areas might have some Italian or Jewish immigrants in them. Again, not the most desirable, but not completely off limits. Under the HOLC, the redlined areas had been enabled to give some lending to Black and new immigrant areas. After 1937, that came to a stop under the FHA. And so for the better part of 40 years, until you get the implementation of the Fair Housing Act after 1968, it was functionally illegal to lend money to Black households, to acquire homes, to improve their homes, to increase businesses. And this is then backed up by the violence that Taja-Nia tells us about, is that a lot of my time is spent talking about places like Tulsa and Black Wall Street, or talking about Rosewood, Florida, a Black community that's destroyed in 1923. Beyond the civil barriers, there is always the threat of violence for Black success. And so this overall system of maintaining segregation, the underlying principle is that the prosperity of Black people should be destroyed and prevented at all costs. Like that's the bottom line. When I went back and did the econometrics on the impact of Dr. King's work with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, just in Alabama, the average household income in Alabama in 1955 was about $150, $160 per year. By 1975, that number was up at about $350, which is still not great, but it's not the dirt bottom that there's no chance of surviving. And so to triple the amount of resources, like this extraordinary economic impact by ending Jim Crow segregation. And when we start to look beyond that into the window from, say, 1970 to 2010, the growth of the Black middle class is extraordinary. The ability to own homes and start businesses, to grow income, even with all of the barriers, particularly with the war on drugs and mass incarceration, undermining any sense of progress, we still persevere and not just survive, but succeed and triumph. And so that's the real power of telling this story and being accurate with the details, is that we see, well, I guess my favorite single thing you asked me, this is now a policy agenda built into this report to finally end the fundamental commitment of the state of New Jersey to keep Black people in poverty and destitution as much as possible. It's to rebuild the entire state economy so that the entire state can prosper, that we're not identifying some neighborhoods, some cities that just will be outside of the opportunity that the rest of the state enjoys. And so that's, to me, the number one thing you can take out of this and move forward and take action on is press your representatives, local, state, federal, to support the policy recommendations in the report. Because it's the first time, not just in New Jersey, but really anywhere, a group of people have come together and said, this is how you tear down the legacy that continues to cripple Black people everywhere.
Thank you so much, Walter. And one of the things I want to bring up is that the housing disparities that were laid down in the early 20th century have a direct effect on the racial wealth gap today in New Jersey. New Jersey has one of the largest, if not the largest, racial wealth gap in the country. It is a wealth gap of $643,000 between white households and Black households on average.
Can you say that again?
$643,000. And it has only increased in the past few years since COVID. We tend to think of COVID as a medical, a health disaster, but we should really also be thinking of COVID as an economic disaster. Many Black people in the state of New Jersey either lost their homes or their homes were increasingly devalued, while white homeowners, the value of their homes only increased after COVID. The racial wealth gap is driven by the racial home ownership gap here in this state. About 78% of white households own a home in New Jersey, compared to just 38% of Black households in New Jersey. And so we see, as Walter informed us, the practices and the policies laid down in the 20th century have a direct impact on the way people are living now in this current moment. Racial segregation was part of the business plan, right? That was built into it, right? It was constituted, it was fundamental to it. And so we need to remind ourselves and be aware of this as we think about the kinds of practices and policies that are going to get us out of where we are now, and not to return to the status quo or what folks call the previous normal, but to think about how can we move forward for a different kind of New Jersey, a transformed New Jersey. And so I want to ask you, Taja-Nia, looking at the policies in the report, the blueprint for repair, and including what we call the Paul Robeson plan for New Jersey, both as an attorney and as a historian, can you please tell us about the importance of race-conscious policymaking within the context of both comprehensive reparations and this current moment, particularly in light of the Supreme Court's stance on affirmative action?
So thank you for the question. So for folks who may not be familiar, in 2023, the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, the highest federal court in the land, ruled that colleges and universities could no longer use race as a decision factor in undergraduate admissions. Somehow, since then, that decision, that determination has been, has morphed into something bigger, broader, and more invidious. Specifically, the current presidential administration is using that decision, which, as I just told you, is about undergraduate college admissions, to claim that all sorts of efforts to close wealth gaps, to advance equity, to feed poor people are somehow unlawful. And so I want to kind of start there, because what we are seeing, I think the lawyers on our side, what we're seeing is not just retrenchment, but just real fear of doing the work. That if we do the work, we will be targeted, right? So in the university context, the fear is, oh, you have people working on reparations at your university, so we're gonna take federal grant money from you. Oh, you have people working on health disparities and health equity in the community where your university is located. Oh, we're gonna take federal grant dollars from you, and you're gonna have to fire people and lay off people, et cetera, et cetera. This is a moment, I think, where fear is driving a lot of folks. And I want to encourage folks in this room to arm yourselves with information and facts, and stand up in the face of fear, even if you're sort of standing up to peers. Because what we can't do right now is capitulate in advance. The fight maybe hasn't been brought to you yet, but it's coming. And the best thing that you can do is to prepare. And so we have, the council has prepared these policy recommendations. And, I have to say, Jean-Pierre won't say, I'll say, we didn't all agree on everything. It's the truth. There were some aspects of the policy agenda that people thought was maybe a little too tame, was a little too risk averse, and could go further, could go harder. And so we don't claim that this is the only way to do this. What we do think is that no one can say they don't know where to start. Because what you have here is a real blueprint for change. And so now that you have a blueprint, you can take it and you can build mini mansions. You have the blueprint, and now it's up to folks to actually use it. So in terms of sort of why it's important to do race-conscious policymaking, it shouldn't surprise folks here to know, having heard what we've been talking about, that much of the disparity, the racial wealth disparity that we've talked about here, the racial wellness and health disparities that are very pernicious and still persist here in New Jersey, those were not accidental. They were not the result of race-neutral policymaking. And I might even argue that, at least in this land, there has been no such thing as race-neutral policymaking, because of the policy that has sort of undergirded our system of government, our constitution, our state making projects has really been one of white supremacy and black suppression. And so what we're talking about here is recognizing that many of the policies that have led us to where we are, and what Walter was sharing with respect to the housing is a good example, right? Redlining was not neutral. Redlining was not race neutral. It was not sort of accidental that people just happened to be in these neighborhoods that got carved out as red. That was intentional. And so we shouldn't approach intentional disfavor, intentional subjugation with this air of neutrality. It wasn't neutral at its core. Our solutions can't now be neutral. We can't claim to now be neutral. The moment demands more. And so even in the face of a government that's going to tell you that anything that benefits Black and Latino people is illegal, because that's what your government's going to tell you, even in the face of that, we have to recognize, and I heard Ryan Haygood said this at a recent gathering, that what we are doing is planting seeds, right? I may not live to see this garden, but the seed work is now. And sometimes that's the hardest part. And that's what I'm calling you to do. Just to say, what can I do? What here reaches me? What here reaches my corner of New Jersey? What here reaches my corner of expertise? Is there something I can contribute here? Because I promise you, there is something, the policy recommendations that we have that are included in the back of the bound volume that you have here, some of them are easy and some are harder. But I want to challenge you to take a look and see what speaks to you. And what can you maybe get a community conversation going about? Maybe it's a universal basic income, which New Jersey has already tried and found it was to be successful. We already know it works, right? We tried it in Newark. We know it works. Maybe it's maternal health care, Black maternal health care. The fact that Black women in New Jersey are, I think, 3 times more likely than white women in New Jersey to die in childbirth in 2025, right? It's unconscionable. Pick a thing that speaks to you and speaks to your experience and see if you can get your neighbors in a conversation. What will it take? Do we have to get our city council people together? Do I have to go down to some of these committee meetings down at City Hall? What is it going to take, and what do you have capacity for? Because there is room here for everybody to be a part of this. This is not just intended to be something that happens in a closed room somewhere where people are talking about, what reparations might look like. This is really intended to be a community-driven movement, as it has always been, from when the first formerly enslaved people started talking about reparations, right? Because they were first. When they first started talking about this, it was a community movement. And formerly enslaved people were getting together, having these conversations, and bringing those conversations together to have a larger movement together, as a collective voice. We can do that here. We have every technological tool at our fingertips, and the time is now. And we want to encourage folks. If you're like, oh, I know I'm really concerned about the air in my neighborhood. I live next to a transfer station. It's terrible. People seem to be sick all the time. Let that be your thing. And let's start showing up to your meetings, showing up to your city council, and demanding that they pay attention to the fact that this transfer station was sited in a Latino neighborhood, sited in a Black neighborhood, deliberately so. The more you press, the more they have to be responsive. When we decide to sit home and to sort of count ourselves out of the conversation, then they can follow the interests of money instead of following the interests of the people.
Thank you so much, Taja-Nia, for that call to action, and also for sort of giving us that truth-telling and that speaking truth to power, particularly about the Supreme Court. Because if you listen to the Supreme Court will tell you that the Constitution is colorblind, and really what they mean by that is that the Constitution, that in their view, they are blind to the injustices happening to Black people over history. And that the central character of racism now, and this sort of main character is white grievance, all right? That is what SCOTUS is trying to protect, the Supreme Court is trying to protect, really, is that this supposed figure of whiteness who is subject to these unequal measures, right? They have no context, no history for this, and this is what they are about. And so thank you, Taja-Nia, for that. And also, thinking about what kinds of policies around reparative policies that you may be interested in. As my colleague Greason Heath points out, reparations is sort of the connective tissue between many different issues. It provides a connection, the link, both historically, but also in this present moment, about how to think about how to repair the harms of the past in the present to move forward in the future. And so, Walter, in thinking about the future, and thinking about possibilities, I would like to ask you, as a scholar of hip hop and Afrofuturism, can you tell us about the role of storytelling and in imagining alternative futures, and the importance of re-narrating the past in the present as part of envisioning a future of repair?
I'll try. So they talked about Afrofuturist design in the bio. The thing that got me the job that I'm in now, that most people bring me out to talk about, is that from 2001 to 2007, I was working with two guys named Christopher Priest and Reginald Hudlin, who were writing for Marvel Comics at that point. And their particular title, the thing that they were working on that I ended up talking to them about was the Black Panther comic. And so I can talk for weeks about what went into those stories and how you end up getting that character to appear in a Marvel Studios film in 2016. But what I did for them was say, as you reinvent the character of T'Challa, the Black Panther, we also have to reinvent his country. Like the way it was created in the 1960s is divorced from the history, culture, the kind of texture of how African independence occurred. And how do you situate Wakanda geographically anywhere? So the bottom line is, for those 6 years, I basically redesigned the Wakanda that you all saw in the Black Panther movie. So Chadwick Boseman says, oh, this never gets old, and he flies through the force field. And all the buildings, the way their technology works, that's all stuff that I wrote like 15 years earlier. And so that's why they asked me about Afrofuturism and storytelling, is that work has been amazing. Disney Plus put out a new series called Eyes of Wakanda. If you haven't seen it, it's definitely worth a look on Disney Plus. It uses a ton of the work from my book, Illmatic Consequences. about how the past, present, and future are all intertwined, and that our decisions today affect the way that we remember, and it changes the options for the people who follow behind us. And that's literally what we're doing here with these kinds of sessions. We're doing the work of changing the history that is discussed and taught so that we can better understand the power that we have today, so that our garden is more fruitful and more abundant 10 years, 20 years, 50 years from now. So in that piece, it's not, well, what hit me hardest, like there was so much that happened in 2018 when the film, we knew it was going to do good. We did not know that there would be memes of children dancing in school, celebrating the fact that they get to go and see the movie. Y'all know the kid that was dancing, kicking his feet up to the side. We didn't expect that it would be years of people, or even with the sequel, and Chadwick Boseman dying. This was a mourning period that we still haven't really come to grips to, even with the sequel. But doing all of that, we rendered a dream of a possible reality that people did not think was even conceivable, that they couldn't aspire to. And folks who didn't like it would then say, well, Wakanda's fake, this is just a pretend place. And as I responded to that, I drew back on my New Jersey history to look at somebody like T. Thomas Fortune and the work that he built to kind of create Black communities that were prosperous. But especially two stories. Down South Jersey in Bordentown, there is a place that was called the Tuskegee of the North, the Bordentown Manual Training and Industrial School. And most people look at it as like, oh, this was this inferior Jim Crow segregated institution. But they were training 4th through 6th graders to become engineers and scientists, radio technicians. They gave them the science fiction of the 1920s and 1930s. And so the irony of Bordentown School is that when the Brown decision was decided in 1954, New Jersey took the emphasis to say, oh, this is clearly an inferior school, we're going to close it. This was one of the best schools ever to exist in the history of the state, one of the best in the country. It trained a legion of scientists who built all the technologies that we ended up using to win the Cold War. How do I know this? Because just down the highway where you all have 195 crosses from Princeton down to the shore, down to say Belmar. Belmar is important for this. There's a place called Camp Evans. Camp Evans is hiring Black scientists to come there and work on the radio technologies that then prove that satellites can work. How do they do that? A man named Walter McAfee calculates the speed of the moon relative to the Earth, figures out the angle of where you've got to send a radio wave out to hit the moon, and then where do you have to be to receive that signal back and hopefully understand it? He does this between 1947 and 1949. The success of his experiment is immediately classified. It doesn't get declassified until 2004. President Dwight Eisenhower in 1952 creates a new top secret category of research to cover McAfee's work that can never be disclosed. They name it Project Diana because he bounces it off the moon. Diana is the goddess of the moon in Greek mythology. His success with that math and with that physics invents the entire science of satellite communication technology. Everybody who's got a phone in here is using McAfee's technology. When I came across this man, he was working at Monmouth University in West Long Branch. And they always had him in the back of the photo like he was a janitor. And he worked there for 17 years. Worse, as I started telling his history and getting his students to come back and tell his story, this has got to be 2000, 15 or 16, his students who have gone on and had extraordinarily prosperous careers, white students, almost exclusively, said, oh yeah, I remember Dr. McAfee. He was the smartest N-word I ever saw. 16! And it wasn't just McAfee. There were over 1,000 families of black scientists and technicians working along, it's not Route 9, it is the Route 35 corridor down the Jersey Shore. So you have Bordentown training black scientists from 1911 until 1954. And then those people who went through those schools as children end up becoming the scientists like McAfee who invent all the technologies we use today. They built all the companies, Motorola and Vonage, and Chester Anderson, a really good friend of mine who's now passed away, built the technology that you use in Dragon software. Like it talks, you talk, it types. This stuff shaped our world, but we don't know any of these people. But they were Wakanda. They built all the miraculous stuff, like the Komoyo bead that everybody uses to kind of say, how do we talk, how do we heal wounds? These things are all based on actual facts. And so I would say, as we talk and go about the policy work, learn the history of Jersey City, learn the history of Patterson, learn the history of Newark, and tell these stories in our families. In fact, I'd go further. I'd say follow the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice on Instagram or whatever social media platform, Facebook, and engage with the community having this conversation on social media and share things that you think from the report so that more people can learn from. Stories that we haven't found yet that you discover. That's our power. That is literally our strength to go forward and build the things that we need tomorrow. So please, like, don't just, somebody tells you Wakanda's fake, says, no, New Jersey is Wakanda. Now, we're not the only one. We got other black scientific communities all over the country. We got other, there's not just one Black Wall Street in Oklahoma. There's dozens of those too. But we've got to tell these stories because they're not in any of the textbooks that we're using to teach our students.
Yes, thank you so much, Walter. And just, for those of you, hopefully you get a copy of the report on your way out. You can, two things about that. One, given historical context, we discuss, Taja-Nia's point about the history of folks organizing, Callie House and her movement in the early 20th century for reparations, as well as Queen Mother Audley Moore. Yes. You'll learn about them in the report. But also, as part of the policy recommendations in the report, we call for the revitalization of Bordentown, right, and the significance of that as part of our recommendations. So you get a chance to look at that. But before we move on to question and answer, I do want to give Taja-Nia and Walter an opportunity for some closing remarks, and then we want to hear from you all, your thoughts, and we love to hear from you. So please.
So I just want to again thank folks for coming out and for engaging. I think that what we can do together is incredibly powerful, and so we're ready to work, and we are looking for co-conspirators, and I hope some of y'all will think about joining us.
Wow, there's just so much, and grateful for all of y'all coming out on a Friday night. There's lots of other things y'all could be doing, especially fighting the traffic to get through here and make sure we sit together. But this is not just making today's world a little bit better. I remember when we first started to do this, there were folks who were like, oh, I don't know if we could say the word reparations and move an agenda around this. I don't know, it's gonna push people away, we're gonna get in trouble. We need that trouble. The reason I went to college where I went. But that piece about having the courage inside yourself, a lot of folks took some courage out of what happened Tuesday. We need more of that for what's coming in this next year. So please, let's stand together.
All right, so we're going to move on to Q&A. Before, I just want to say a big thank you to Walter and Taja-Nia for taking time out of their Friday also for being here with us and their commitment to the council and to the work. So we really appreciate it. Thank you so much. So let's open it up now to question and answer now. We want to hear from you all.
Thank you so much. Just learning about this study you guys have for reparations, just wanted to know how far along you guys are as far as deciding when reparations are coming for American Indians or Black Americans.
Sure. So in terms of deciding, we are actively involved now in organizing, advocating, and doing the work. It's in terms of the timing, it's really, can we get all of you and folks around New Jersey to put pressure on the state, on the government to actually get moving. Tuesday was just the beginning, right? The release of the report was just the beginning. Really now it's time to do the work of organizing, the education, activating folks. And so in February, be on the lookout because we will have, in some ways, a relaunch of our campaign for reparations here in the state. We'll be hosting different events around the state, including some town halls in Trenton and Newark. We'll be having some community dialogues during Black History Month. We'll also be introducing some legislation, hopefully, around New Jersey apologizing for slavery. So we'll get folks organized around that. So be on the lookout for that. And we will be calling on all of you here in this room. So as Walter said, if you go to our website, if you go to NJRC.counsel.org or you go to NJISJ.org, you can there sign up for our newsletter and for info. And be on the lookout because in February we'll have a dedicated page for those of you who are interested in supporting us and helping us to organize and volunteer in support for reparations. We'll be going down to the State House. So we'll be doing a number of different things. And in terms of the timing, it's really up to, can we get the folks here in New Jersey to be aware of what's going on. So 56% of folks in New Jersey don't know that slavery happened here in New Jersey. So we've got our work cut out for us in terms of educating the public. But once we educate the public, we can activate folks to get them to tell their representatives, hey, I want you to repair these harms, and these are these policies. Pick this up and get this moving. And so that's the work that we're doing, and hopefully you will join us on that journey.
Thank you all for your very powerful thoughts and sentiments. Really, this is just truly awesome to be here. You mentioned Paul Robeson. I always get very excited hearing about Paul Robeson because fun fact is that Paul Robeson Jr. has actually been to our Miller Branch Library. My father, who headed the cultural department for Jersey City Library in his day, in the 80s and 90s and so on, was fortunate enough to bring Paul Robeson Jr. here and talk about many of the things you are. Speaking of northern and southern racism, how do you draw a line to help, say, in this day and age, 2025, where maybe some folks believe that racism does not exist here in the North, or they think, oh, it's getting better, it's getting better. How do you draw comparisons between southern racism and northern racism and help them understand that both were damaging, but also in the North, equally as damaging?
I see Jean-Pierre is pointing the mic to us. I appreciate the question. I think that I generally, when I talk about racism, the history of racism in this country, I don't draw a distinction between northern racism and southern racism, particularly because, at least in sort of the earliest days of European settlement and African trafficking to what would become the US, these were all the same people. So the people who were enslaving folks in Bermuda and in Barbados and in what will become Haiti are also the same folks enslaving folks in New Orleans and Charleston and Perth Amboy. It's literally the same people, same families. So I think one way to do that is really to sort of rely on the record. Thankfully, we have a historical record that draws these connections for us, and we can share that with folks in ways that are accessible. That's another part of this I think is really important, and why I'm excited to be at a library. One, I love libraries. But two, because what libraries sort of represent to me is making the inaccessible accessible. And so if there's a way that we can craft our narratives such that people don't feel like this information or even what you're describing, sort of racism in America, is inaccessible to them, if we can get beyond that, then I think we've done great work. Sometimes people, I mean, at least folks who will claim that racism has gotten better, I don't think that's wrong. I think, sure, there's a lot of change. There's been a lot of growth. I wasn't able to go to college because I was smart. I was able to go to college because of affirmative action. I was able to go to college because the college that I wanted to go to was interested in Black students. That's why I went to college. It wasn't because I was some exceptional type. There's a whole lot of others just like me who did not get the opportunity that I got because they were coming up a generation before, including every other member of my family. So I think there's a way to kind of talk about history and to use history to tell these stories. One of the things that I really love about Walter's work, among many, is Walter's been engaging with graphic history and telling stories about hip hop using the graphic history method and genre. And I really think that that is one way. John Lewis used graphic history to tell parts of his autobiography, to really tell a story about the civil rights movement in this accessible format that you could share with little ones, you could share with big folk, you could kind of, get even some of the comic heads around, kind of get them into it. It's a way to get these stories into the hands of folks that are hungry. And I think we have to be ready to tell these stories in different ways. The last thing that I'll mention, at least with respect to racism, I think that one thing that has been incredibly powerful, maybe the most powerful ideology in all of American history, has been white supremacy. It doesn't stop. It's relentless. And this idea that there is this hierarchy of human value with white people, whatever that means, where we can put that in quotes, because even that changes. Because there's a time when a lot of white folks aren't white. So when this hierarchy of value where white people are on top, the power of that idea, we will continue to live with for centuries. And what I want to encourage folks to think about is to kind of, can we imagine a future where white supremacy is not guiding every move? Like, what does that futurism look like? Where white supremacy is not at the core of our policy making, at the core of our educational system, at the core of our law enforcement and policing, where something else, maybe human value, is at the core. What might that look like? And just sort of, I think, talking about that such that we aren't ourselves giving into the narrative that there are certain people that are better than others simply because of their genetic makeup. Oh, sorry, yes, please.
I'm gonna be real fast on top of that, just because there's a specific way of dealing with that sense of northern and southern racism, slavery, segregation, what have you. We tend to read that division about the Mason-Dixon line out of that middle of the 19th century, like how does a Confederacy form and who joins it and who doesn't? And New Jersey is a great example of a place that didn't join the Confederacy, but kind of wishes they did. It's the only Union state that votes against Lincoln twice, and basically tries to fight not to grant equal rights, and it really has to have its arm twisted to even end slavery as being sanctioned by federal law. And that's true for any number of other dimensions. So the one example I use to break up that say, oh, it's the North and the South, is basically, no, slavery is across all the colonies, but it's different kinds of slavery in different places. And for the New Jersey in particular, once you get that 1804 gradual emancipation law, which that's the only time you'll hear me call it that, is because that's the formal name it's given, you actually have 50% of people who own slaves in New Jersey sell their slaves south to make a profit so they don't have to emancipate them. This happens in Connecticut, this happens in Delaware, this happens in Massachusetts. And so there's a big change in the way we do the history, I want to say 20 years ago, when they started talking about the second Middle Passage. So, the Middle Passage is the trip across the Atlantic. But there's a second one that happens with the sale of slaves from Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, south into Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. And that's as massive, in some ways more massive, than the trade across the Atlantic. But no one talks about the actual passage of selling enslaved Africans out of the North into Maryland and Virginia during this period of, oh, we're abolishing slavery. Those folks don't want to give up their property. And they're going to get some kind of payment for what they put out. And those kinds of things, it just ties the entire structure together. I can go up to Montreal in the 1720s and find people who are stealing Africans, even though you're not supposed to under French rule. This thing is all of North America. It's the entire Western Hemisphere. And so all these divisions we want to try and draw to kind of say, oh, well, no, South Carolina was really just so distinct from Virginia. Yeah, no, that's a rhetorical kind of piece of propaganda. It's all slavery. It just takes different forms depending on when and where you see it.
I know there's also some questions up front, yeah.
Okay, so as a young person who cares deeply about equity and justice, what role do you think we play in conversations like these, especially when it can feel like adults don't always give us the space to speak about it and then, or like be taken serious?
I love that question. Yeah, I want to give you something for that. I love that question. So, question of what you can do. You can start here. And let's arm you with the facts. And then see if your school might be willing, or wherever you might be engaged. Maybe it's not a school, maybe it's your local library. See if they might be willing to host like a youth night to talk about it. This is not for sale. It's free. Copies can be brought over. Young people can be talking about it. It's illustrated, like there's graphic elements, so that might be interesting to people. There's the information is presented in different ways, which might be accessible to folks at all sorts of educational levels. So I think that's one way to just get started. The other way is to start where you are, right? There are spaces that you are in, spaces that you occupy that grown-ups don't occupy, right? You probably are all over the social media. I am not there at all. Start there. Use what you're good at. And get some friends to do what they're good at. And now y'all got like 5 of y'all got a collective, and you're bringing in other people. You're talking to people from other schools, talking to people across your neighborhood. That's just one way to start, and that costs you nothing. Because again, we have all of these tech tools, and yet we're more isolated than ever. This is a way to bring folks together and to get them coming. Most of the public library, not most, many public libraries have youth sections, youth librarians. They have sections, specific sections and specific programming for people that are under 18. So this is a way to sort of get in touch with those librarians, call them up and say, hey, I was at an event at the Jersey City Free Public Library. Would this branch be interested in doing something? I want to talk to other teenagers about this, or other young folk. That's one way.
Yeah, I got two real things off the jump. If you know, or you or anyone you know is an artist and wants to do things like this, I have a massive social media platform where people are starving for this art. And so we could take just a single line or a single page out of there, convert it into a comic series, and folks would jump on to see what it's about. Help you build a podcast, help you build a video series, like whatever you want to create. My best example is down in Long Branch, New Jersey. They have a social justice school, and they've built an entire program that's just about DJing and MCing and training young people to get these skills about throwing parties that also deliver this kind of content. And so we would love to build more programs that whatever you want to do, we're going to show y'all how to make money with it, and you're actually advancing the mission and that building out new ways. Don't wait for adults to give you platform. You build your own platform.
Yes, thank you so much, Walter and Taja-Nia. I really appreciate that. And thank you so much for the question as well. What I will say is at the Institute, we host annually something called a Youth Power Summit, which we have teenagers, young people, and people in their 20s. We bring them together to engage them on our issues, including reparations. I hosted a reparations workshop with a young person, and we had people in middle school, high school, and college age folks engage in that. And we are organizing young people. We want to not only organize folks, young people, but for them to be leaders in this movement. And so we really want only not your input, but for your ideas and your vision. And so we want your leadership as well. And so, reach out to us. We also have, to Walter's point about technology, we'll have something for young people in technology coming out hopefully in the next few months. So be on the lookout for that, about how we can get engaged. But we really do want to have young people be organized around the state. And we're working with our partners who do national work on this, to organize young people on reparations. And so we are developing training and opportunities for young people because we understand that young people are very key to this movement. So we do appreciate you.
I thank this panel for the information that you gave. I'm a local historian, and Jersey City has been fighting for civil rights and improvement. A lot of people don't know that Bishop Walter Alexander, who was obviously a Baptist church, and he started the first, one of the first civil rights organizations, the NAAC. He was from Jersey City. He lived in Jersey City, right on Kearney. His secretary was Ida B. Wells. We also have a long history of trying to improve the race. There was a Dr. George Cannon. He was an early filmmaker in the 1916 and 17. He did about 5 or 6 films to bring light to our environment, because when The Birth of a Nation came out, he said it did not portray us positively, and so he wanted to put his contribution. But not only that, he knew about the redlining in this community. So what did he do? He started a bank right on Kearney Avenue, John Brown Savings and Loan Association. The name of his film company was the Frederick Douglass Film Company. And so I just want to, as a historian and working with the Museum of Jersey City, to bring that information out. Because we have been in the forefront and we just have to get everybody energized with that. And I was also want to talk about how when we were trying to get an exhibition about the history of Jersey City, I made it known that Jersey City could not be Jersey City without the slave labor that came over here with the Dutch. We were key. They tried to do it without labor, but they couldn't. They couldn't attract the labor. So this city is as much our city as anybody else. And a lot of people don't realize that there was a lot of slavery. And like you said, when we talk about the only reason why they put that 1804 thing, they never claimed it slavery. It was the name slavery wasn't in there. We were the last state to abolish slavery. And the only reason why it happened is because when the Congress did it, we didn't ratify it. It's just that when the 13th Amendment came, they had no other choice. But there were still people that were slaves because they were called indentured. They didn't call them slavery. So I just thank you for that information because we need to know that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm glad to be here. I'm dealing with this important topic
Can we
because
give you
it's
a
on
mic?
my
I'm sorry, I
mind.
want to make sure
It's
that.
So
on
people
my
on the
mind.
recording need to hear.
Has been on my mind.
Thank you.
And I want to add a couple of things. Since April 22, New Jersey's legal marijuana market has generated over $2 billion in total revenue, which has resulted in nearly $62 million in state sales tax and over $6.1 million in social equity excise fees. I'm wondering how this ties in. And also, it says here, 2022, the recreational sales, they made 330 million. And the tax was 20.1 million. 23, 68.1 million, 41.8 in sales tax. 924, 991 million, and 43.2 million in sales tax that's supposed to go to some part of it, Black and brown communities that have been impacted by the arrest of all these teenagers, and they got all these records and on their backs that haven't been dealt with, promises. But how can we tap into this huge, unbelievable amount of money that New Jersey is taking in with this legalized marijuana?
Sure. So thank you so much for that question. It's an important one, and I'll go first, and then I'll pass it over to my colleagues. But what I will say is that one of the key organizations that are part of the council is the New Jersey Policy Perspective, who are the experts in the state for tax and budget. And they have been on this about the marijuana revenue and about how it can be used for reparative policies, right? And so many folks are interested in using marijuana revenue for multiple reasons, as you point out, because of the history of mass incarceration and the drug war, but also because of the possibilities to kind of repair those specific harms, but what it could be used for other kinds of things, like potentially a universal basic income program in the state, right? Or to address other kinds of structural policies that we have in mind. And so we do have, and we are in conversation with folks who have the expertise, who are aware of this, and who are engaged in thinking about potential possibilities for how this money could be used. And I think it's an excellent point, right? A lot of folks are interested in this, and there's many ways the money could be used. And there are many folks who have different interests about specific programs, right? And so that is one major source of revenue, but there are other sources of revenue that we are also looking at in addition to that to think about how we can fund some of the programs, some of the policies that we are interested in. So thank you for that.
But who's sitting down at the table with them, the Cannabis Commission?
So I'll say that my colleagues at the Institute who work on our criminal justice reform are involved in those conversations. I personally am not, so I can't say what organizations, but there are.
I don't mean to put you on the spot. I'm just saying somebody should be there.
Yes. So there's like a coalition of folks, of organizations. I can't name all the organizations off the top of my head, but there is a coalition called For the Many, which is one of those organizations, and it's a coalition of advocacy organizations around the state that are thinking about how to use those funds and what to do with them. And the Institute, we are one of those organizations, but there are many. But also, part of what we have to do is put the pressure on the state legislature to actually use those funds for what we are directing them to do. So we will say, we have these policies that we want the money to be used for, but we have to put constant pressure on the elected officials to actually use that money for those purposes. And so we have to design legislation where it's specific to say this specific piece of money, this piece of revenue for candidates has to be used for funding this reparative policy. So if it's for alternative kinds of policing that doesn't involve using nonviolent means, right, or using violence prevention advocates, or using the money to provide other kinds of resources, we have to be constantly providing not only pressure on getting it passed, but then to make sure it's implemented. One of the issues we have in New Jersey is that once we get something passed, there isn't the kind of pressure to make sure it's implemented. So we've got some good things in the books, but either there's no money associated with it, no revenue, or there's no enforcement mechanism. There's no way of ensuring that it's actually happening. And so those are two things that we are trying to work on and improve so that we actually have good government processes. But yes.
Since there's so much money involved, there needs to be a legal team, it seems to me, representing our interests.
Yes, so I think you raise a good point, right? That's something as part of what we want to build, right? I think there are folks who are there are legal advocates who are interested in particular kinds of issues who do, they aren't as prominent, right, in terms of like public facing, but they are doing the work on the ground in terms of representing folks who are directly impacted, justice impacted, who've been formerly incarcerated, folks who have been survivors of the drug war, right, who are their voices are involved in this, and not just legal representation. And who are shaping policy and are part of these conversations, and we've been involved in conversations with some of those folks. Those folks have been organizing. They meet regularly, including folks like the Race Counsel, who are part of these conversations and shaping how folks who've been negatively impacted by the drug war to shape policy and how Panelists funds can be used. So this is something that we have been part of and been learning about and learning from.
It seems if it's handled correctly, this could be reparations. We could involve reparations right there with all this huge pot of money.
It definitely can. I agree with you on that, and I will pass it over to Walter because I think something that you're pointing to, and this Walter has made a comment before, is how wealthy a state New Jersey is, how much of revenue, how much of money there is, right? And so sometimes the state would talk about, oh, it doesn't have the money, or as Walter has pointed out, New Jersey is a very rich state. There's a tremendous amount of money, but it's a matter of how this money is being distributed and to who.
Exactly.
And so I'll pass it over to Walter to make some comments as well.
That's one of the hardest things for me is the point that you're hammering home. So as co-chair on the Economic Justice Committee, so we spent the better part of 2 years talking about, okay, how are these funds distributed? What are the ways that we do the most good with the ideas within the proposal? And you get at a point that I have to talk about a lot about kind of the scale of how much money is a lot of money. So when I typically do this lesson in class with folks, I'll ask my students by show of hands to say, in their 3 best years of income, how much money do they think they'll make? So these are, 19, 20-year-olds. And they'll typically, as a group, say, oh, I'll be really successful if I make $100,000 a year for 3 consecutive years, except for my finance students. My finance students will, on average, say, I want to average at least $20 million a year for my 3 best years. And you should see the looks on their faces when they look at each other, and they're like, how do you realistically think you're going to get? But it's just a different set of assumptions about the kind of nature and access to money. So you're talking about a pool of $2 billion, right? And that sounds big. On the scale of what we're talking about, when we got into the committee, that was the biggest fight we had at the end about the report recommendation. My 2 colleagues, Henry Coleman and New School, Derek Hamilton, are really hard-nosed economists. And they're like, what can we actually get the state to agree to? And so they're talking about numbers that are essentially in the hundreds of millions that are reasonable over time within the state's budget capacity. I'm not constrained that way. I do work with Sandy Darity on his stuff on reparations and economics. Darity looks at this in terms of a $14 $15 trillion need national. And if we're using Darity's formula, you're talking about almost $2 trillion that you need in New Jersey to undo the damage that's been done. And it's just a much bigger number. You go to the state Senate with that, they're gonna freak out and be like, that's completely unrealistic, there's no way we can get there. But it requires that we rethink a lot of the kind of core assumptions about what's possible. And so when we look at, say, the cannabis numbers, yes, $2 billion when we're talking about any of us in this room, it's a huge amount of money. But I'm also looking at the headlines where Tesla just approved a $1 trillion payment to their CEO. Yes. And it just completely distorts the rest of the market of what the rest of us have to live on. And so those are the kinds of things about talking about the realistic numbers.
People are sending a serious message to Tesla.
About
also.
what's valuable, yes, and they need to.
And that's what has to happen. People can make the difference. I don't know about how much money is involved, about people not buying their cars, but they're boycotting Tesla and
yes.
Making an impact.
And that's the thing, like if we're at a $1 trillion scale in today's US in the last year, that's too small to think about what we need to do for reparations, even in a state of New Jersey. That we're talking about a sustained investment to rebuild things that should have existed 200 years ago. And that's where I'm saying, yeah, we can get started with $2 billion, but that's gonna go away very quickly when we're talking about not just us, but the next 3 or 4 generations of repair that's required. Somebody?
Thank you.
I wanted to talk about Bordentown. Can you hear me?
It's
I
hard
can
to
hear you.
hear. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
She
I
said
wanted to
Bordentown.
talk about Bordentown.
Okay.
Bordentown is very important in my family. I have several family members who attended Bordentown. I had always wanted to go there, but they shut it down. And the reason it was shut down is they did it. But my concern is that property is 400 acres of land that Bordentown sat on. And the Attorney General, Matt Platkin, set up a committee last year, I believe, to study what's going to happen with that property. And my concern is that that school needs to be reopened. The way it was shut down was very racist by the then governor at that period of time in 1954, claiming that because of the Brown versus Board of Education, he couldn't find any all-white schools in the state of New Jersey. So he concluded that Bordentown was racist because it was an all-black school. And he claimed he could not find one Caucasian student to enroll in that school, otherwise he would have kept it open. All I'm saying is that 400 acres of land with those buildings, I drove down there last year to see for myself what it looks like now, and the property is still there. But they took half of that property and turned it into a jail. Not only for black males, but for black females. And Platkin wanted to set up this committee, and I believe Mr. Haygood is a member of that committee. I don't know if are you part of that committee, or you an offshoot of that committee with different subcommittees?
So Ryan, so as you point out, Ryan is the president and CEO of the Institute, and we are involved, and we've been calling for the closure of the prison, right? We want to, as I said before, we want the revitalization of Bordentown to go back to what it was, right? To be this kind of center for Black excellence, right? And we want to end the incarceration of youth, of people, right? To sort of this kind of cruel kind of way of inverting it from place of education to a place of incarceration. And as part of repair, we want to take it back to its roots to be this kind of site of Black futures, Black repair, Black excellence. It's a place where Black people can thrive, right? To educate and allow for Black people to be Black people in a way that they were not allowed to be. And that's what we're calling for, both in the report, but as Ryan's representation, my colleague Ashanti is leading some of this work for us and calling for this work in Bordentown. And we've made proposals to the state and advocated in written reports and engaged and advocated for these changes, and we'll continue to do so. And Ryan, as you pointed out, Mr. Haygood, and my colleague Ashanti are leading this effort for the Institute. But if you'd like to find out more, we can talk afterwards, and I can definitely put you in touch with some of my colleagues, or particularly Ashanti on this.
Thank you very much. I would like that.
Hi, I have questions for each of you. So I'll start with Dr. Brutus. The image, this image, I want you to know that ever since this first came out in 2023, I think about it every single day. I have it on my phone, I show it to people, I talk to people about it. So I'm just interested, how did this come about as a representation of how bad things actually are in New Jersey?
Well, thankfully here we are lucky and fortunate to have our wonderful graphic designer, Dick Gerard, in the audience. There he is. They put together many of the wonderful graphics images in this report, including this cover and that. And so, Jake and his brilliance and his artistic genius, he put that together along with our president and CEO, Ryan Haygood, and our communications director, Lori. And they sort of, as Taja-Nia was saying earlier, right, folks learn in different kinds of ways and take information in different kinds of ways, including, as Walter knows well, the visual, right? And so we wanted to put it in a way that is, given that the impact on you and you think about it daily, it's a visually arresting way of folks taking information to understand the kind of steps, right, and a way of taking in, sometimes numbers can be very boring. And so trying to do it in a way that will capture your imagination and your thought, which is done. So, our wonderful Jake is here. So if you want to ask him further questions, but thank you for that. We appreciate that.
Thank you. Dr. Henderson, so I do work around fully funded and equitable public schools in New Jersey. And in the report, it talks about desegregation. And I wanted to know how, in your facilitation, how did it come about as that was going to be the focus of how we address the school situations?
I wish I could give you a clean and sort of wrapped up story about the origins of that commitment. But as I remember, I think this sort of comes out of a recognition that those schools that are most highly segregated in New Jersey are also those schools that are least high performing. And a commitment to educational access, excellent educational access for all of New Jersey's children is also assuming from the beginning that the only way to do this in this state with this history is to desegregate those schools. And so what does that look like? I think that's maybe more to be worked out with some of the educational policy folk and folks who are interested in school design and kind of what can be possible. But I think it really is this history of racism, and particularly how racism has fueled the failure of so many of New Jersey's public schools and the concentration of Black and Latino children in those schools, that understanding goes into this call for desegregation and what that can mean. Now, of course, as we know from the Bordentown example, that desegregation is no panacea and can also be used to further racist goals, right? The notion that there was a governor who said if he had one white student for whom Bordentown was a preference, he would have kept it open, is a statement about white preference, right? And the privileging of white preference. If one white student could have saved Bordentown, then our logics are twisted. And I think that this is sort of what was in the mind of the committee when they were thinking about how can we actually make real that constitutional commitment to equitable educational funding. What does that look like, and what can that look like, and what does that need to look like, is a recognition that racism and white supremacist beliefs has been at the core of the failure of that constitutional promise for the state's young people.
Thank you. And then the last question, Dr. Greason. So I'm transitioning to be a public high school teacher, a history teacher, and so it's really important to me that I have examples for kids of Afrofuturism and of a different world. I think Wakanda was great for that. The YA novel Pet, I don't know if you read that, but that was fantastic for that. Can you give me some other examples of that I can share with when I have students?
Oh, that's a very, very long answer. I'm going to say two things right off the bat, just so you can check as soon as you have a minute in the next couple of days. So I've worked with the New York City public schools for the last 5 years. It led to the Hip Hop Project. They have a database of social studies, supplemental education materials that hundreds of thousands of resources. My personal favorite are the Hidden Voices curriculum that they have, that are all things that have been omitted from broader social studies discussions, but they brought in a whole bunch of scholars and basically built out an entirely new online library that's all free. So New York City, it's weteachnyc.org. And if you just go there, they have a little subheading called Hidden Voices. That's more than enough to get started, but there's hundreds of other pieces. The other group I work with is in Virginia, out of the University of Richmond. They're called New American History. They specialize in multimedia materials that are tailored to every state's curriculum. So you can go in there and you can find materials that are designed to be taught in New Jersey classrooms. And again, it's completely free. So these are the folks that give you all kinds of things that it would take multiple lifetimes to pull everything together. My favorite that, of course, Jean-Pierre, Taja-Nia mentioned, if you go to www.graphichistorycompany.com, we have a lot of ways of taking really complicated subjects and turning them into posters for classrooms, lesson plans, unit plans. I think the one that has been the biggest this year is we did a mini comic about Kendrick Lamar and his Super Bowl performance and all the different pieces of the history that went into constructing that. That blew the doors off. Like the graphic history thing generally, we went from having maybe a couple dozen of them, where now there are thousands of graphic histories that are available. But the Kendrick Lamar thing really, like millions and millions of people come and want copies of that and want to explore, want more of what that discussion has been. So yeah, talk with me more. There's just no limit to what we can build for you.
Thank you all very much.
I know we're short on time, and we have one in the front and then one in the back. Yes.
So I'm just sitting here thinking that, for me, there's a lot to say. There's a lot that needs to be done. I'm actually a victim of being punished for speaking too much. But I think it's important that we share what we know and the right thing to do. In some cases, especially in Jersey City, my experience has been there's retaliation for speaking truth to power. So when you get there, you want to be able to seek help or have people come out and share the same sentiments with you, but people are afraid of retaliation, and this is one town that will retaliate. I mean, so if we were to have some kind of coalition or some kind of drop box, if that is appropriate to say, where people can send information and people can speak on their behalf and form that strength in those numbers. Because policy and procedure is violated so often in this town, which is why we're in the mess we're in now. So I remember, and Dana can attest to this, she was our block watch captain. They'll tell you to call in if you see something, say something, and when you say something, the people who you said something about knows who said it, and you just can't do that openly. I have no fear in speaking what I need to speak about, but at the same time, there's punishment that comes with it because of the greater powers that don't like what you have to say about them. So there should be some kind of coalition. If you have a suggestion of how that can be, drop box, and also a refuge of where you can go. I mean, we've had so many issues in our town, so many rallies and stuff. I'm looking at one young lady here who's Palestinian. Now, one of our elected officials talked about the genocide that's going on. You understand? So we can't even stand up for who we are and without being retaliated against. I mean, it would be nice if a little bit of this education of African American history and the history of Jersey City would be mandated for some of our elected officials of color, because we wouldn't have to deal with a lot of things that we're dealing with now.
Thank you for that. So we agree with you, and from the beginning when this initiative was launched, what we sort of appreciated and understood that there would be folks who wanted to participate and wanted to contribute, but may not be able to do so for whatever reason in a public fashion. And so the Reparations Council website, I think, still has an open place, a Dropbox, if you will, for people to contribute. And we have asked and been asking folks to share their family histories and family stories. So stories about Bordentown, stories about Jersey City, stories about Cape May, stories about Newark. We want those stories, and the site is open and still accepting submissions for that.
Yes, you can go to NJReparationsCouncil.org. We accept submissions of video, audio, written as well. And in terms of a coalition, we have a coalition for the larger reparations advocacy organizing, right? And we are meeting regularly, but also we are doing what we're calling community dialogues, where we are going into communities to have intimate, sustained conversations about how folks think about reparations in their communities, right? So if you're interested in potentially hosting one, or folks who would be interested in hosting one here in Jersey City, we'd be interested in talking to you about that. We certainly are going to be launching one in Newark. We're going to be doing one in Trenton, but we are looking for other spaces and places to do that. We've previously done that with Rutgers University in Newark, where we did many different community dialogues across Newark, and we're looking to take that across the state. So if Jersey City is interested, we certainly are most interested in doing that. And out of that, you can have a sustained space for people to have the conversations that you're looking for, right? And then create and build the kind of advocates and leadership, because we do want to have hubs around the state for reparations advocacy, right? We don't just want to have it centralized in one place, but we want folks who are leaders, who are interested, who are organized around the state, and we can provide support so that we actually can make reparations happen here. So if you are interested, we can certainly have a conversation afterwards about how we can move forward and have those kind of dialogues here in Jersey City. Thank you.
Yes. Congratulations. Fantastic report. The Institute does fantastic work. Thank you for doing it. And thank you for not being a shelf document, because you can develop academic material and it stays academic. So you're taking your show to the road, to the people. Hopefully it will turn out to do something. I have one question, I have one more statement. I'd like to know what you think about the Evans, Illinois reparations that the City Council adopted out there. And secondly, almost 60 years ago, I attended a rally in Brooklyn for the fight for community control of school, Ocean Hill, Brownville. And one of the persons I met at that time, as a young man that never heard of before, a woman who worked dressed in African garb, she got up and she called herself Queen Mother. That was Ollie Moore. And she spoke glaringly about reparation. This is over 60 years ago. And I had been around a lot of the movement people, Sonny Carson, Independent Corps, the Panthers, Ram. I hadn't had nobody speak about reparations. And she before me after and spoke about reparations, convinced me today that if we ever want to have institutional justice in America, we have to deal with the issue of reparations. So what do you think about the Evans, Illinois decision to adopt a reparation plan?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'll start off first and then pass it over to my colleagues. What I will say is thank you so much for bringing up Queen Mother Moore once again. For those of you in the audience who are interested, if you're interested in learning more about Queen Mother Moore, the historian Ashley Farmer just released a book about Queen Mother Moore called Queen Mother. It came out, I believe, this past Tuesday. So to go take a look, if you're interested to learn more, it's the first full biography of Queen Mother Moore. So I urge you to look into it. And hopefully Jersey City will have it here available for you in the library. And then also about Evanston, Illinois. So Evanston, for those of you who aren't aware, Evanston was the first in the modern era town or city to have implementation of a reparations program. The initial program was focused around housing. In Evanston, they did what was called a harm report to look at redlining in Evanston from 1919 to 1969. And from that period, they came up with a series of recommendations. One of those being that those who were directly impacted by redlining in Evanston would receive funds for specific housing purposes, and then also their descendants as well. But what they found was that many folks who were living in Evanston thought that that program was too limited, and so they wanted to expand that program to provide for direct cash payments. And so, Evanston, part of the significance of Evanston is that it's a form of experimentation, because it's leading the way in actual implementation of reparations. It's at the scale of the city, it's not at the scale of the state or at the scale of the federal government. Some folks have critiqued Evanston for saying that it isn't reparations because it's either a housing program or because it's not direct cash payments to close the racial wealth gap. It's not considered reparations, so there are folks who are critical of it. But my perspective, and just to be full disclosure, I'm familiar with many of the folks who are involved in this, including Robin Ruth Simmons. And Evanston is near and dear to my heart because I went to graduate school there for several years. And so what I will say is that Evanston opens up a possibility for thinking about what reparations could look like in actual practice. As we think this through, we can learn things from Evanston when we think about what to do in New Jersey and other locales around this country, including in places like California, which is also leading the way in places like providing the land back for those who had their land taken as part of Bruce's speech and things like that. So that's what I will say about Evanston. It's a form of experimentation. That's what we need. We need to have the space, because we think of reparations not just as an end, but as a process, right? And as part of that process is thinking about possibilities of what things could look like. And it's just the beginning. It's not really the end of a conversation, but the beginning of one. But I'll pass it over to my colleagues if they have anything else to add.
There was just a couple pieces on Evanston. So that was one of the fundamental pieces we brought into the Economic Justice Committee along with the California conversation. And I think it's moved on now. There's a big event in New York State that they're putting together these kinds of conversations. So it's crucial that they kind of kick it off, that we could start to take the questions more seriously. And I guess related to a similar point that was raised before about how do you desegregate within that, that's one of these key questions within how do you actually determine damage and how do you go about repair. And I just wanted to share, this is a really old piece of data, but it's still very prevalent, is that as we attempted to implement Brown and then go about fair housing, and we said we wanted to desegregate, no one ever decided kind of what would an integrated community be. And so you have this real disparity in the mid-1980s where white residents, well no, let me do it the other way around. Black and immigrant residents, when surveyed, would say an integrated community was 25% non-white. White respondents would say an integrated community was 3% non-white. And so when you have that level of disagreement in the perception of what constitutes an integrated community, of course you're going to get this kind of failure to actually achieve anything because there is no clarity about what the goal is. And this is a very similar thing about the scale that we operate at. Darity is very critical of only doing federal, don't do local reparations or state reparations or corporate reparations, only do federal. And he kind of looks at CARICOM and the international scene, and he's like, that's an entirely separate question. I come at it and say it's much more about comprehensive reparations, so that every beneficiary of historic injustice has to make a coordinated effort to repay over time. And so that's saying all of these efforts are valuable, and that all of these things need to move us forward. And so to that end, when we're looking at what makes for an integrated community, my standard for my own work is economic autonomy. And this is a very specific historical formulation. It's not about the racial wealth gap in particular. It's for each household, can they sustain themselves without having to work for pay? That do they have sufficient resources that they can meet all their basic needs, keep a home, keep clothing, keep food, keep medical care, without having to work? We hit that standard, which is really very clearly what a lot of Scandinavian countries go for. I think Ireland just adopted basic income for all artists over time. There are ways we can guarantee quality of life for everybody in ways that are affordable and sustainable. But we haven't done enough, like what goes on in Evanston, to get towards that specific goal. Sure.
Thank you. This is going to be our last question this evening.
Yeah, how you doing? I grew up in a place, Plainfield, New Jersey, and in the 80s, I could ride my bike as far as I could, and it was nothing but black homeowners. Went to the schools, I had nothing but black teachers. Fast forward to the 90s, you started to see black people disappearing. Not just in Plainfield, New Brunswick, Edison, etc. Now I go to Plainfield, I'm lucky to find somebody that even speaks my language. And I was wondering, through your studies, did you uncover what was behind the black flight in the middle of New Jersey?
So I'm gonna let Walter handle this.
So yeah, you definitely want to take a look at suburban erasure. So that joint's been out a little bit over a decade. The Plainfield story in particular is done by a really amazing scholar named Tom Segru, who's up at NYU. And he looks at the transition over the last 40 years of the 20th century in Plainfield. And at the end of it, it's prioritizing who has access to what housing. And so I want to say it's 83 or 84 under Tom Kane. There's a real distinct effort, and Reagan enabled this, to destroy the black middle class, which is reliant on civil service. And so all the infrastructure that you knew in the 1980s, you fast forward 10 years into the mid-90s, and that employment infrastructure is gone. So the folks who had been middle class, lower middle class to upper middle class black households, they couldn't sustain any part of the suburban part of New Jersey. And so in places that I really focus on, like Asbury Park, it's horrendous. You go and look at Camden, you go to any of the major cities in the state, Trenton, the devastation by the mid-90s is intentional. It was to move the black households that could hold on out into places where they were outnumbered 8 and 9 to 1. And then to consolidate lower income black households and people who were struggling, formerly incarcerated, struggling with addiction, senior citizens, to concentrate them in these cities where social services could be provided, but they could also be contained by law enforcement and by police force. So that's what happens, is you get this stratification of, for 1 out of every 4 black middle class families, 1 stands and is able to survive, 3 fall back into working class status or poverty. And it just wipes out the sense of black stability that had existed at least back into the 1940s.
Thank you, sir.
So first, I just want to say thank you to you all for your time, for your energy this evening.
Okay.
I want to thank the Jersey City folks for organizing this, and then I want to thank our panelists, our wonderful panelists, Taja-Nia and Henderson, and wonderful Greason for their time this evening. And I will just leave you with this. You know, we are living in the world that slavery made, and we want to live in the world that reparations made. And so we want to live in a New Jersey where black people can thrive, where black people can flourish. And as part of that, I just urge you all to go to the Institute's website or go to the New Jersey Reparations Council website, sign up, and hopefully you can be part of this journey, this effort with us moving forward. And hopefully on your way out, take a copy of the report. Maybe you'll start a book club, maybe you'll engage with your neighbors, your families, your friends on this. And so have a good evening, everyone. Thank you so much.